Hello everyone, my name's Amanda Stott and I'm the Subject Coordinator for NRS123 Health Law for Nurses. Firstly, welcome to the subject, and this is the first in a series of mini lectures that occur throughout your Module 2. I think it important just to start to give you a very brief overview of what you can expect and what it's important to do to maximise your experience in the subject and also to get the most out of it. I think hopefully now that you've thoroughly read your subject outline, because that is the most important information available to you with regard to what's expected in the subject. For example, the text that you require, and you do really need to have your text on hand, and the one that we are working from this year is Staunton and Chiarella Health Law for Nurses. A lot of students do ask me about the edition that's required, and if you do have an older edition you might be okay, but we always encourage you to go with the most current edition, the 8th edition, because all the readings and that you're referred to in your tutorials and in your activities are directly numbered straight to that edition. But of course we recognise lots of you will have older editions, and if you're a little bit short of cash, as we all are, then by all means you can use that. I suppose it's also really about, in this first lecture, sort of explaining to you why you actually have a dedicated law subject in your curriculum in the Bachelor of Nursing. Well, as nurses, it's, you know, for those of you who are nursing already, I know we have some enrolled nurses, so welcome to the subject as well. But really, nursing is a profession that, and healthcare per se, is a profession that's heavily regulated by the law. You know, regardless of what people do in healthcare, whether a paramedic, doctor, physio, social worker, and so on, the environment that, you know, from an institutional perspective, means that nurses or allied health professionals can be in situations where they need to have a basic understanding of what the law is and how it affects practice. As nurses, you're not expected to be lawyers. The law is a very complex science, if you like. There's a lot to it, but certainly a basic rudimentary understanding of how the law operates, the main laws that affect our nursing practice, and most importantly, an understanding of where to find information, because at the end of the day, what we are aiming to achieve is that you are obviously clinically proficient, but most importantly, that you are professional, you are safe, and that profession, that ability to be professional and be safe is usually commensurate with your knowledge and understanding of your rules, your regulations, your policies, your guidelines, your standards, and most importantly the legislation or the laws that surround your practice. So again, we're not expecting you to be lawyers, but it is important that you do understand just the basics in relation to health law, because an understanding of law as it relates to health is very important in the provision of safe and competent patient care. And I'd like you to think of it as a resource for you as an individual. When you have greater knowledge on a particular topic, it sort of informs your clinical practice, and it makes you a better professional decision maker. So, what is the law? Well, the law is, well, there's the definition by Forrester and Griffiths. It's an old one, but it never changes. The law represents a set of socially sanctioned rules and principles generated by history and values of the society in which it operates. So I think it is a set of rules, and the rules that govern a society, whether you know, these rules can, you know, they're socially sanctioned. They are determined by governments, by lobby groups, through bills, and ultimately through legislation. And, you know, we all are aware of what it's wrong to do, usually, you know, murder, stealing, all of those sorts of things. So it's a benchmark or a line in the sand that a society operates to, and when people fall below that benchmark or set of rules or principles, well, that's when they can get into trouble. I think it's important to know that the law is not a static thing. It's ever changing. It varies from country to country. Of course, you know, there's certain rules or regulations that are pretty consistent across all societies in terms of murder and so on. But things do change from country to country. And, you know, for example, euthanasia bill, there's one, or the euthanasia law, there's one that's really a hot topic at the moment. It's legal over in a lot of European countries, but at the moment it's sort of it's come to the fore again in Australia. It was passed and was legal in the Northern Territory some years ago, and then it was rescinded, but now it's coming to the fore again. So again, the law adapts to contemporary times in terms of what's current, in terms of moral decisions and major decisions. So, you know, it's not a static thing, but it's never black and white. I think that's the other thing to remember about the law. We would like to think that it's very clear cut, but obviously it's not, and that's where we can get complexities, which is some of the cases that we'll look at throughout the session. I suppose it's useful to think of a distinction between law and ethics. Ethics is always something, it's to do with right and wrong, which is very similar to the law, which is also about right and wrong. But from an ethical perspective, you know, whereas from an ethic, if you look at it individually from your own standpoint, you might tell a lie to someone and you know that it's wrong, but, you know, are you going to be socially sanctioned for that demeanour? Whereas, you know, inherently everyone's individual ethical moral standpoint can vary again, and some people have a very strong moral code, others don't. But the difference between ethics and law, whereas ethics you can do something wrong from an ethical perspective and you won't necessarily get into trouble for it. However, with the law, when you transgress, that's when it's backed up by the sanction of punishment. There are rules and regulative. So the law is very prescriptive, it's punitive in that it tells people what they must do, and just as importantly, what they must refrain from doing. So all the legislative guidelines that we look at, for example, the Poisons and Therapeutic Goods Act, or, you know, the Mental Health Act, it's very prescriptive in telling us as nurses what we must do. I think it's a good point to mention at this stage that it is unusual that you would ever directly engage, per se, with the absolute legislative guidelines as they are written. Far more common, and this is why you must understand the importance of these policies and guidelines that you are being referred to throughout your course, is that the policy, for example, the policy on safe medication handling in New South Wales public hospitals, that policy is directly written from the legislation. The legislation on the Poisons and Therapeutic Goods Act is very wordy, very legal in terms, but our profession, experts in our profession, they look at that legislation and then put it into our policy documents in a user-friendly, professionally relevant way so that we as nurses understand it. So I always want to make the point clear to you that, you know, these policies that you look at, they are the direct articulation of the actual law or the legislation. So they're really, really important. All right, so that's just a little opener of the law. Have a look at some of the videos that are in your accompanying module in Module 1, and we'll cover more in the tutes as well. I think too, from this introductory lecture, what legislation or laws are really pertinent to health professionals? And this will give you an indication of why you're studying the subject, because you know, we are heavily regulated, as I mentioned just earlier, and, you know, I've only put up 4 here, but there are a whole heap more, but we didn't want to overwhelm you at this point. But as we work through our different topics, we will be referring to the different legislative frameworks in that particular context area. But I really do want to impress upon you all the major law that really governs the practice of all health practitioners is what we call the Health Practitioner Regulation National Law Act. And it's always shortened to the national law. That's the overarching legal framework that guides our praxis. Now, to put that in simple context for you, say a nurse makes a mistake at work, okay, or does something wrong at work which is in breach. For example, say they give a medication that is, for example, severely harms a patient. They're in breach of, obviously, the Poisons and Therapeutic Goods Act. They might be in breach of their professional standards, so they'll face disciplinary action that way. But the overarching law that they've breached also is the national law, which is like an umbrella type of legislative protective framework. One of the main purposes of this law is protection of the public. All right, so whenever you're a health practitioner, and that means if you're either a, you know, physio or psychologist, podiatrist, if you breach something to do that harms a client or patient under your care, you can bet your boots that one of the first thing, if it goes to disciplinary or legal hearing, that you will be cited as in breach of a particular section of the national law. And in addition, depending on what you've done, whether it's something under the Mental Health Act or if it's a breach of privacy or you've given the wrong medication, you will also be in breach of that particular legislation, one of them listed here, as well as your professional conduct standards. So I think that's important to highlight, that when nurses unfortunately can do something wrong, it's not only from a legal perspective but also from a professional perspective. So this is what we'll look at again throughout with lots of different cases. But legislation pertinent to health professional, there's a whole heap. And I think I want to just sort of calm you down a little bit. You know, a lot of students think, I've got to know the names of laws and everything else. But look, I think it's always the national law, obviously, and if we're mentioning the Poisons and Therapeutic Goods Act, it's useful to just be able to cite them correctly. But we're not about tricking you up and sort of having an in-depth examination of your legal knowledge of different legislation. But certainly if we're mentioning it in readings and in your activities, and obviously when we come to looking at social media and breach of information and privacy, you know, we will refer to that particular Privacy Act. So, you know, it's just a rudimentary understanding and having knowledge of the difference. But just to recap, what I'd really like you to focus on is just the terminology. Legislation is the law that is passed usually by Parliament, and again, these legislative guidelines come and go. We don't actually, as from a day-to-day nursing perspective, read these legislative bills, but what we do interact with and look at and have to abide by every day of our working lives are the policies and the standards that are directly driven down from those laws. All right, so let's move on just to ways in which nurses can be responsible at law. And again, just giving you an introduction why we're actually studying this subject, the relevance for your whole course and indeed your entire profession. But not to frighten you, but again, when nurses follow the rules, and this is why in your workplace learning, down in the labs, and all your lecturers and tutors impress upon you the importance of knowing these guidelines and rules, whether it's giving out medication, whether it's how to interact correctly from a therapeutic communication perspective with a patient, because, are you gaining proper consent, for example? Because if you do the interaction or carry out the interaction with your patients or colleagues, family members in the correct way and in a professional manner, then it is highly unlikely that you'll ever fall to any of these listed things. So things that we will look at, and ways that nurses can be found responsible at law, obviously with professional negligence. Now, that's a really interesting area. Negligence is a huge topic, and a lot of students do confuse the terms sometimes between, understanding of it. To be guilty of professional negligence is a very, very serious matter, and you have to meet certain conditions. And a lot of people just use the term negligence to say, oh, someone didn't write up a healthcare record when they were supposed to, or someone forgot to do a dressing on patient B, and they will say they were negligent. Well, that term in law is very, very specific. To be negligent or professionally negligent, which comes under the civil jurisdiction, usually you've got to have the main one is damage must be done. But we'll look at that. But certainly you can breach your standard of conduct, you can breach your duty of care, but are you guilty of professional negligence? Well, that's quite specific, so we'll look at that. And the other one's assault and battery, and it sounds dreadful, but this is where we come under the tort of trespass. Trespass to a person is related to gaining consent. All right, so that is why it is so important that your therapeutic interaction with patients in terms of introducing them, explanation, you need to know the types of consent, when, consent is not necessary, because from a real perspective, and it happens every day of the week, I'm sure, in healthcare, but technically, when you do not gain correct consent, well, technically it is considered to be an assault, which is putting in the threat of someone, the unlawful touching, and the battery is the actual unlawful touching. Sounds dreadful, but you don't have a baseball bat and actually batter someone, but the battery is that term that means the unlawful touching of someone. Now, obviously, when someone is charged with assault or battery or found, cited with that sort of tort or civil wrong, it's only when a patient complains, all right? So, and there's an investigation launched. So, and I reiterate that bad practice happens every day of the week, and sometimes, you'll witness things that you think that was less than satisfactory professional conduct in relation to gaining consent or conducting a procedure with a patient. But again, I always say it's usually only when a situation is closely and carefully scrutinised, and that's usually as a result of a colleague or an institution complaining about a particular staff member, or the patient themselves complains about something. Then everything will be really come to the fore. And particularly doctors, surgeons, this is where they're so careful in gaining consent for particular surgeries, because if something goes wrong with that surgery and then the patient, for example, say negligence, you know, they have damage done, they have their right ovary removed instead of their left ovary, so they launch a civil action for professional negligence. What will come under that is the way that the consent was gained as well. So yes, they'll look at that, and you know, they can be found successful in gaining damages for perhaps, you know, assault or battery, under the fact that they didn't gain the consent was not fully informed. All right, defamation. Defamation is something that is concerning, particularly from my perspective, and something that in the last few years has raised its ugly head in relation to the nursing profession, and it is directly related to the issue of Facebook. Defamation was always a very rare thing in nursing, or indeed healthcare, where someone is defamed in relation to something that is written about them that absolutely affects their psychological, physical, you know, financial well-being. And you might just be aware of the moment that Rebel Wilson was successful in suing, I think, Women's Day, big case, defamation. But in healthcare, defamation, very rare, but now with Facebook. And there's been a precedent set in that. In the last few years, there was a teacher actually who successfully sued an ex-pupil who defamed her on Facebook, and she was successful in gaining damages. So when we look at social media, defamation is something that is of great concern, because it's in the written form, it's verifiable, it's public, and it's only a matter of time, I feel, before perhaps a healthcare worker will you know, perhaps be cited in a legal case in relation to defamation. Now, crime, and this is where you probably think, well, I suppose all the others are crimes, but this is where, in the next, particularly chapter 1, you need to know the difference between how the law works in society, if you like, or how the law is operationalized. There's lots and lots of different branches, but the two that are most relevant for our purposes are the civil jurisdiction and the criminal jurisdiction. Civil is when it's not about punishment in terms of people going to jail. It's about people gaining damages for harm that's done, and a lot of the civil stuff applies to nursing or healthcare. But unfortunately, when a crime's committed, and this is again very, very serious, it's backed up with the sanction of punishment in terms of jail, but nurses can and do found guilty of crimes, and it's usually to do with intent. We look at a terrible case that's Megan Haynes, the nurse that, barely call her a nurse, but still she had access to insulin and murdered those poor old women in the nursing home. So we look at that. That was an absolute crime. But most of the crimes we look at in relation to healthcare are drug offences, unfortunately, stealing drugs, forgery, that's another big one. Yes, so a lot of that sort of thing. And then we look at the infamous case of the surgeon Jayant Patel. He was the Indian doctor who worked notoriously out of Bundaberg Hospital up in Queensland, and he was a really unusual case in that he worked in the hospital and he did operations that were well outside his scope of practice, and he was initially charged with reckless indifference, and he was charged with that crime. He appealed, it was upheld, so it's just a saga, but that's an interesting one. So we look at those, okay? And some of the other offences, well, nurses can be found wanting in relation to mishandling of clients' property. the subtext of that text is perhaps, stealing and so on, but mishandling, failure to report child abuse in some jurisdictions, or failure to report infectious diseases, falsifying documents, failure to carry out employees' instructions. So again, if you think of the work health and safety, all of those types of things. Discrimination, there's another one. So lots and lots of different ones. But again, in the whole scheme of things, it's the exception rather than the rule, thank goodness. But certainly nursing is a very well-populated profession, and of course lots and lots of different people from all walks of life, and all have problems and differing viewpoints, so we do look at quite a number of those cases throughout the session as well, some interesting ones. All right, so might just